Hello everyone, and welcome to Architecture, the Big Idea. This is part 2, and if you recall, in part 1 we took a quick overview of the roles and responsibilities and how they interact and switch around and move around in quite a fluid way. However, if you recall, we ended with looking at the client responsibilities as a safeguard, with all sorts of safeguards needing to be in place for anyone who should venture onto a construction site, into a building, into a plot of land, whatever it is the client or owner may hold. So in part 2, we're going to look at what those safeguards may be. With the built environment, where the safeguards are quite strictly laid out and are quite simple to understand. So we begin with planning and development control, which has been in existence in England since 1932, with the first Town and Country Planning Act. And the idea of town and country was a response to ideas such as Clough Williams-Ellis looking at England and the octopus. And the body of the octopus was a metropolis such as Manchester or London, and the tentacles were linear development extending out into the countryside. And it was felt that the character of each was being affected by the other, that we were losing our countryside essentially. With this linear development, you could drive from town to town to town along these linear ribbon developments without ever actually seeing the countryside that was beyond the houses that lined the roads. So there was a big campaign to try and maintain the character of town and countryside, and it's a rather polemic position to take that the character of town is defined by what it's not. It doesn't look like countryside, and vice versa. The countryside doesn't look like a town, and so the two characteristics remain distinct. And that's developed over time. It's not such a polemic now, it's more defined, but it points to a key element about planning and development control, that it's all about land use and how land is allocated and for what uses and what purposes. And so that's our first category. The next one are the building regulations, and a little difficult to understand at times for anyone not familiar with architecture, is that the building regulations are all about building standards, building codes they might be called elsewhere, but they're not about maintaining high standards of the building and protecting the building. They actually stem from the Public Health Acts of 1936 and 1961, later combined into a Buildings Act in 1984. But they've been around for a long time, and they are set out to protect the people who may inhabit a building, principally so they may get out safely if there's a fire, they won't be trapped in a building, that the building is structurally secure and won't collapse on them, obviously, that it's suitable for the uses. There are no balconies to fall over, stairs, tripping hazards, things to collide with, and then other elements creep into all of those as well. But essentially, building regulations are a public health act, and that's a key thing to remember. The last thing comes in last of all, actually. So 1932 for the planning, 1930s and 1960s for the building regulations. The health and safety at work comes in the 1970s. The 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act created the Health and Safety Executive, and these regulations also apply, although on a construction site there's a further layer of regulation, which are the CDM regs. And what these do, the construction brackets design and management regulations, take the health and safety at work regulations and assign them according to the different roles that we met in the previous video. So they're not so much about what has to be done, but who must do it, who must carry out the work to ensure that those safeguards are put into place. So those are the three safeguards in the built environment, and they're quite strict, quite firmly set out, very difficult to avoid. You wouldn't want to avoid them, but they can also be characterised. And if we do that, we can say that the land use question is really the big environmental question. The public health is all about social aspects, public security, public safety, all those sorts of things on a public scale, community scale. And then the health and safety at work we can take as being a personal or individual safeguard. So the interesting thing for me is that I'm very interested in archaeology, and I'm very interested in ecology as well. And so it's interesting to try and draw a comparison. And we can first look at the cultural environment, generally known as the cultural environment. In Europe it's typically thought of as the historic environment, and especially so in the UK, where even then the historic environment is rather dominated by the archaeological sector. So they're kind of narrowing definitions, but cultural environment is a much broader definition, and that includes modern day sort of living heritage, intangible heritage, music, arts, all sorts of other things come under cultural, so I prefer that term. But typically it means an historic environment. And when we look at what the analogous things may be, when we look at land use, or the big environmental scale of heritage protection, it tends to be allocating sites and designating sites and trying to ensure that extra layers of planning control are applied. And so an example of that might be the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Another example might be national parks and areas of archaeological interest and so on. At the social level, not quite so easy to define, and perhaps needs a more recent interpretation, where recent heritage reforms, not all of which were enacted in England, sought to introduce something called conservation management planning, and within that was a desire for a statement of significance. And the significance is to look at the value that the heritage is held for different aspects of society. So it may be the value of heritage to community and to shared experiences, to our health and well-being, to our engagement with the community around or the history around, making people feel rooted in their locality. And so perhaps the best example of that would be the statements of significance, part of the conservation plans originally devised by James Semple Kerr in 1982 in response to the 1979 Borough Charter. Moving on, we have the personal level, or well-being if you like, and the engagement is a good example of that, engaging people in the historic environment, which is only a very recent thing, since about 2004, or perhaps since about 2000 when discussions began. Engaging people in the local environment is quite a good thing to do. It's interesting, it informs people, it keeps them busy, active, engaged, enthusiastic, all the things you would hope. But there's no particular definition, as with the social aspects, the community level aspects. There's no real definition of what exactly must happen at that point. So, except for one, which are those same CDM regulations, which since the new regulations of 2015 now do apply to much of archaeology. The archaeological sector sought an exemption in the pre-construction phase of investigations on a site, but it's a single exemption, and even with that in place, the health and safety at work legislation still applies. The exemption, I wrote to my MP to try and get some clarification on it, and the exemption is solely to avoid the confusion that an archaeologist may then be considered a principal contractor on a building site. That doesn't strike me as a very likely scenario, but that was what was sought. So there is some health and safety at work, there are some individual things being applied, and at that level you can also then consider it to be a personal individual safeguard. You can bring in ideas of mental health and well-being and other aspects that support people who are directly involved. And again, you can bring that in at a social level. So, in summary, there are definitely parallels. They're not very clear, they're not well defined, but they do exist. As we move on to the natural, where we might look at ecology, it would appear to me there are parallels, but they become a little more difficult to define, and you do have to seek them out. So on a large land use scale, again, the technique of designating sites, taking sites, ring fencing them, bringing them out of the planning and development system, if you like, so that they're owned in trust and managed separately. That continues. So the example I found here is the Forestry Commission can support people devising woodland management plans, as can other agencies such as this one here. And these sites can be taken up, designated. National parks as well, that's a little more interesting because you get multiple land use within a national park. But the management of those sites can be looked at, and that's the typical answer in conservation. At a community level, again, really difficult to find the parallels. They're quite hard to find. But within planning and development control came an EU directive in 1985 and subsequent revisions of that, demanding the implementation of environmental impact assessments. And in the UK this was also taken up by the archaeological sector, but it principally applies to ecology. And the idea is that any development that's occurring in an area that's subject to planning or development control would also be subject to an environmental impact assessment, and these would look at the character of the environment and how that character can be improved and developed, how harms can be mitigated and avoided. And so we may put that at a community level. It's really a planning demand which suggests an environmental land use level, but it's looking at the quality of the environment. And so we might think of communities of species, habitats, and that sort of thing. So we can consider that a community level ecological safeguard. At an individual level, perhaps personal is not the right word because that sounds human-centric, but individual, we might think of something similar to the EIA, the Ecological Impact Assessment, which is usually abbreviated to ECIA. That looks at a particular list of key species and looks to protect those, whether they are secure, whether there are no communities of protected species that are going to be harmed. And so we might also think about the typical bioblitz that is done on a nature reserve, where we look to see what species are existing and what the natural community actually looks like at the individual level, and we might try to protect that. A little hard to define. It's not clear if that's quite what I might be looking for, but it seems as close as we can get. But it means that we can then look at all three channels, if you like, of the environment: the built sector, the cultural sector, and the natural environment sector. And we can see the same three levels of safeguards occurring again and again: the individual, the social, and the environmental. And we could put them all together and create a little matrix, a 3x3 matrix like this. Here, where I've selected some clip art off the internet to use to illustrate the point. And it starts to look quite clear, quite simple, quite easy to understand, and we could look at all these safeguards for development across the landscape and the townscape and think, well, what's impacting and where are the problems arising? Is it affecting the ecology at a species level? Is it affecting questions about land use and should areas be set aside? Are we considering the statements of significance when we're looking at cultural heritage and so on? So it becomes an interesting model to use. I also feel that when it's put together like this as a matrix of safeguards, it begins to look a little bit like sustainable development. And so I thought it was worth comparing to these list of 17 sustainable development goals identified by the United Nations. And to my mind, this is a little more confusing. The headings here tend to identify problems, poverty and hunger, a lack of education, various inequalities, and the only one that looks like a solution is the one at the end. So we could categorise these in the same 3 levels. We could consider these ones highlighted here as being personal interests or concerns, safeguards at the individual level. At the society level or a community level, we could consider these highlighted in amber. Strong institutions, economic growth, sustainable communities. Now, at the ecological level, as before with the 3x3 matrix, identifying the ecological safeguards is a little more difficult. And so even here, the United Nations have used 3 quite broad-brush terms. We have marine life, we have terrestrial life, and we have the climate. No real definition in these headings as to what that might mean. And the one response is to form partnerships and set goals as to how to address these problems. All the rest are a great list of problems. And so collected together, we can see that all of those can be listed within the same 3 categories, and then perhaps a response given from the built environment, the cultural sector, and the natural environment as how we could address those. That would give a much deeper response than the one suggested here. However, those aren't the official colours of those logos. They are specifically designated by the United Nations in this form. A multitude of colours. They don't particularly seem to relate to one another. Well-being is not necessarily related to terrestrial ecology. Poverty is not necessarily related to reduced inequalities. They clearly are related, but not directly. So my feeling is that presentation isn't quite as clear as just looking at them as simple safeguards and looking at how we can respond. So if we go back to the safeguards, we see that we form a 3x3 matrix, and it's somewhat analogous to the 3x3 sides of Erno Rubik's magic cube. And if we look at this, we can then see the Rubik cube gives us an opportunity to look at these safeguards, a 3x3 matrix, at different levels. And so we could take the same categories as used in the matrix, a built environment, a cultural sector and a natural environment, and see how they could respond to each of the challenges. We could look at the individual, the society, and perhaps a more governmental level. So individual organisations and governments, and see how they could respond to each of these. We could also consider the same 3 roles we looked at originally when you're looking at an individual project on a site. Perhaps when you're looking at master planning and you're at a very early stage, you could consider such questions. So should there be a response to each of those 3x3 problems highlighted as safeguards at the level of client, designer and contractor? And certainly in the building trade, contractors will know of better materials that could be used. Clients can make better decisions or be encouraged to make better decisions. Designers are expected to know a lot of that information. So at each level there could be a response. And so in that sense, where the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals gives us one projected solution to form partnerships to then look at each individual question of the 16 remaining problems, Here you could actually take anything and create, if you wanted, 27 responses to the 9 safeguards that you might implement. And I think with that you would have a capacity to answer almost all the questions that are being raised today about sustainable development. Sadly, not all of those safeguards are in place, and so I think it could be argued that if that were the picture, I think today's safeguards look more like that, a sort of deformed, slightly chaotic picture, where if we took the dark blue, because it's a dark colour, to be a black, there are a few holes in our general picture and a few things to fill in. And that's a little bit of a shame, I think. I think there's potential for the architectural approach and the design-led iterative approach of architecture to fill in those gaps and to create a picture that would look quite simple, quite clear, very easy to understand, and quite straightforward, and can be applied to any project anywhere. So that's all I've got to say on that one. Thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and bye bye.